Some souls don't forget, even when the world does. The first thing Ethan Cole noticed wasn't the barking, because there was none. It was the silence, the kind that settles heavy in a place where sound used to live. And in the far corner of the shelter, beneath a flickering fluorescent light, the old German shepherd lay still on a thin gray blanket, eyes open, not restless, not afraid, just waiting, as if time had paused around him and forgotten to start again. The tag on the cage read Rex, retired K9, 10 years service, but someone had scribbled beneath it in fading marker, unadoptable, and people passed by without slowing. Families with bright voices and children who wanted younger dogs, faster dogs, dogs that still chase things. But Rex didn't move, didn't beg, didn't even lift his head when footsteps came close. And maybe that was why Ethan stopped, not because the dog called out, but because he didn't, because in that quiet, there was something familiar, something that reminded Ethan of long nights overseas when the world went still just before something changed. He stood there longer than he meant to, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the way the dog's ears twitched slightly, not toward him, but toward something deeper, something beyond the walls. He won't last the week, the shelter worker said softly from behind him, her voice careful, like she'd said it too many times before. He's too old. Joints are bad. Doesn't respond like he used to. Ethan nodded, but his eyes stayed on the dog, on the faint rise and fall of his chest, steady, patient, like a soldier who had learned how to wait without asking why. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the parking lot, and a cold wind rattled the loose sign above the door. But inside, it felt like time had folded in on itself, and for a moment, Ethan wasn't standing in a shelter in rural Montana. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter, where instinct mattered more than explanation. Rex shifted then, just slightly, lifting his head an inch, not enough to show interest, just enough to reveal his eyes, deep amber, clear despite the years, and they didn't look at Ethan, not directly, but through him, as if measuring something he hadn't said yet, something he hadn't even realized himself. And that was the moment it changed, not with a decision, not with words, just a feeling, subtle and undeniable, like a door opening somewhere you didn't know existed. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he said, "I'll take him." And the shelter worker blinked in surprise, glancing back at the old dog as if double-checking what she'd heard. "Are you sure?" she asked. "He's not like the others." Ethan gave a small nod. "Eyes still on Rex?" "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think that's the point." And as the paperwork began and the sun dipped lower outside, casting gold across the worn floor, Rex lowered his head again. But this time, his ears tilted forward, just slightly, as if somewhere deep inside, something long silent had started listening again. The drive back was quiet, not the peaceful kind that settles the mind, but the kind that presses gently against it, asking questions without words, and Ethan kept one hand on the wheel while the other rested loosely near the gear shift, his old pickup humming low as it rolled along the narrow two-lane road that cut through miles of pine and open sky. And beside him, Rex did not move much, his body steady despite the bumps, his gaze fixed forward as if he already knew where they were going, even though Ethan himself was not entirely sure what waited at the end of the road. The sun had dipped behind the mountains by the time they reached the cabin, leaving behind a fading band of amber light that stretched across the horizon like a memory trying to hold on. The place was small, weathered wood and a sloped roof that had seen too many winters, but it stood solid, tucked at the edge of the forest where the trees grew thick and the wind carried the scent of cold earth and pine sap. Ethan stepped out first, boots crunching against gravel, then walked around to open the passenger door. Rex hesitated for a moment before stepping down, slower than a younger dog would have, but not weak, just deliberate, as if every movement had purpose. The evening air was crisp, somewhere in the distance a branch shifted and settled, and for a brief second, Rex froze, ears tilting sharply toward the sound, not alarmed, just attentive. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. He had learned long ago that not every signal needed to be questioned. Inside, the cabin greeted them with stillness, the kind that comes from long stretches of solitude. Dust lay thin across the wooden table, and the old cast-iron stove stood cold in the corner. Ethan set his bag down, and moved with practiced rhythm, striking a match, feeding the stove with dry logs until the first flames caught and began to breathe warmth back into the room. Rex wandered slowly, nails clicking softly against the floorboards, pausing at corners, near walls, near the door, his nose lifting slightly as if reading something written in the air. Then he stopped near the far wall, standing there longer than necessary, his head angled just enough to suggest he was listening, truly listening, to something beyond the reach of human hearing. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching him, not with concern, but with a quiet curiosity, the kind that does not rush for answers. Outside, night settled fully, wrapping the cabin in a deep blue silence broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. Dinner was simple, a can of soup warmed over the stove, the smell filling the space with something almost comforting. Rex lay nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but not asleep. Always aware, always present. Hours passed without much movement, until sometime after midnight. When the fire had burned low and the air had grown colder, it began. Not a sound exactly, more like a shift, a subtle change in the rhythm of the night. Rex lifted his head instantly, ears rising, body still as stone, his eyes fixed toward the door. Ethan followed his gaze, listening, but heard nothing, just the quiet stretch of darkness. Then Rex stood, slow but certain, and walked to the door, placing one paw gently against the wood, not scratching, not demanding, just waiting. Ethan felt it then, not fear, not urgency, but something deeper, a pull, faint but undeniable, like a memory brushing against the edge of awareness. He stood, moving closer, his hand hovering near the handle, and for a moment, he hesitated, because somewhere deep inside, he knew this was not just about a dog needing to go outside. And when he finally opened the door, the cold air rushed in, carrying with it a silence that felt alive, and Rex stepped forward into the darkness without looking back. Rex moved into the darkness as if the night itself had called his name, his paws silent against the frozen ground, his body steady despite the cold that bit through the air, and Ethan followed a few steps behind, pulling his jacket tighter as the wind brushed past him in slow, whispering currents. The forest stretched ahead in shadows and silver outlines, the moon casting a pale light through the branches that swayed gently overhead. And for a moment, it felt less like walking and more like being led, as if each step had already been decided long before he took it. Rex did not look back, not once, but his pace was measured, never too fast, never out of reach, just enough to keep Ethan moving forward, deeper between the trees where the path faded into nothing but instinct and quiet trust. Somewhere to the left, a branch cracked softly under its own weight, and Rex paused, head turning slightly, ears lifting with precision, not reacting to the sound itself, but to something behind it, something that lingered just beneath the surface of the night. Ethan stopped beside him, listening harder now, but still there was nothing clear, only the distant hum of wind and the slow rhythm of his own breath. Then Rex stepped forward again, angling downhill where the ground dipped toward a cluster of older trees, their trunks thicker, their roots rising from the earth like worn bones, and the air changed there, colder, heavier, carrying a faint scent of damp wood and something else. Something human, though Ethan could not place it at first. His pulse slowed, not from calm, but from focus, the kind that narrows the world into small details. A broken fence post half buried in snow, a set of shallow impressions in the dirt, too uneven to be animal tracks, and ahead, barely visible through the branches, a shape emerged, a small structure leaning slightly to one side, its porch sagging under the weight of time and weather. Rex approached it without hesitation, his body lowering, slightly as if shifting into memory, not fear, not aggression, but purpose. He circled once, then stopped near the edge of the porch, his nose dipping, his breath visible in short bursts against the cold air, and then he made a sound, not a bark, not a growl, just a low, steady tone that carried more meaning than noise. Ethan moved closer, boots careful against the uneven ground, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and that was when he saw her, a figure partially hidden near the base of the porch, an older woman, still and quiet, her coat dusted with frost, one arm resting awkwardly against the wooden beam as if she had tried to steady herself and simply run out of strength. For a brief second, everything seemed to hold its breath, the trees, the wind, even the night itself. And then Ethan stepped forward, dropping to one knee beside her, his hands moving gently, steady, checking for warmth, for breath, for any sign that she was still there beneath the cold. And there it was, faint but present, a slow rise, a fragile rhythm. He exhaled, not in relief but in understanding. This was why they had come, not by chance, not by accident, but because something had guided them here with quiet certainty. Rex remained close, his body angled toward the woman, his ears still alert, watching not the forest now, but her, as if guarding something that had already been found. Ethan glanced at him, really looked this time, and for the first time since the shelter, he saw not an old dog, not a forgotten K9, but something else entirely, something that had not come here to be saved, but to save. And as the cold air pressed in around them, and the faint light of the moon settled over the worn porch, a single thought moved through Ethan's mind with quiet clarity. Some things do not lose their purpose, they just wait for the moment to return. Ethan did not rush, because rushing had never saved anyone. Instead, he moved with the kind of steady care that came from years of learning that every second mattered only if you used it right. His hands firm but gentle as he adjusted the woman's position, lifting her slightly away from the cold ground. His breath slow and controlled in the freezing air, he removed his jacket without hesitation and wrapped it around her shoulders. The fabric already losing warmth to the night, but still enough to hold something back, something fragile, something worth protecting. Her face was pale beneath strands of silver hair that had come loose. Her eyes closed, but her breathing remained, shallow but present, like a faint echo refusing to disappear. Rex stayed close, closer now, his body angled just enough to shield her from the wind that slipped through the broken boards of the porch, his ears still moving, still listening, not outward anymore, but inward, as if the danger had passed, and now something else was unfolding, something quieter. Ethan glanced around, taking in the leaning structure, the worn wood, the sagging roof that whispered softly with each passing gust. This place had not been lived in for a long time, not in any way that left warmth behind. Yet she had come here, or been brought here, and for a moment, that question lingered in the back of his mind. But he let it go, because answers could wait, survival could not. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, the screen lighting his face in a pale glow as he searched for a signal. One bar flickered, weak but enough. He placed the call, his voice calm, direct, giving the location as best as he could describe it. The old cabin past the ridge, near the broken fence line. He stayed on the line only long enough to make sure help was coming. Then he ended it, because right now, presence mattered more than words. He shifted again, checking her pulse once more, still there, still holding. Rex lowered himself slowly beside her, pressing gently against her side, not with force, just enough to share warmth, to remind the body of something steady, something alive. Ethan watched that for a second, the instinct of it, the quiet intelligence, and something in his chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. This was not training alone. This was something deeper, something that had stayed with the dog long after commands had faded. Minutes passed in silence, the kind that stretches but does not break, until finally, the woman stirred, just slightly, a faint movement of her hand, her fingers brushing against the rough wood beneath. Her breath catching for a moment before settling again. And then her eyes opened, not wide, not fully aware, but enough to see shapes, to see light, to see them. She looked first at Ethan, her gaze unfocused but searching, then slowly, as if guided by something older than memory, she turned her head toward Rex, and everything about her expression changed. The confusion softened, replaced by something else, something that did not belong to this moment alone. Her lips parted slightly, her voice barely more than a whisper carried by the cold air, but clear enough to be heard. "You came back." Ethan felt the words more than he understood them, felt the way they settled into the silence around them, and Rex did not move, did not react with excitement or confusion. He simply remained there, steady, present, as if this was not a surprise at all, as if this moment had been waiting for him just as much as he had been waiting for it. And as the distant sound of approaching help began to rise faintly through the trees, Ethan realized something he could not explain. something that did not need explaining. This night had not begun when he opened the cabin door. It had begun long before that. Somewhere in a past neither of them had fully left behind, and now, somehow, it had found its way back. The sound of the approaching engine came slowly at first, distant and uncertain, like something deciding whether to arrive at all, then growing steadier as headlights began to flicker through the trees, cutting thin lines of pale gold across the dark forest. And Ethan exhaled quietly, not in relief but in acknowledgement that this part of the night was shifting, the moment of finding giving way to the moment of being seen. The woman's breathing had grown a little stronger, still fragile, but no longer fading, and her eyes, though heavy, remained open just enough to follow the outline of Rex beside her, as if letting him out of her sight would mean losing something she had only just found again. Rex did not move, his body still pressed gently against her side, his warmth steady, his presence unwavering, as if he understood that leaving now was not yet his role. The vehicle finally reached the clearing, tires crunching against frost and gravel, and two figures stepped out, their voices low and controlled, carrying the calm urgency of people who had done this many times before. Ethan stood slowly, raising a hand to guide them in, his words brief, precise, giving them what they needed without excess. They moved toward the porch with careful steps, kneeling beside the woman, checking her condition with practiced efficiency. One of them glanced at Rex for a moment, perhaps expecting movement, perhaps expecting resistance, but the old dog did not react. He simply watched, his eyes alert, measuring, as if deciding whether these new arrivals were part of the path or a deviation from it. And then, as gently as he had settled beside her, he shifted back just enough to give them space, not leaving, just allowing the moment to continue. The woman stirred again as they spoke softly to her, their words simple, reassuring, guiding her back toward awareness. And once more, her gaze drifted not to the people helping her, but to Rex, her expression holding something deeper now, something less like confusion and more like recognition unfolding in slow layers. "I knew you would come," she whispered, her voice thin but certain, and Ethan felt the weight of that sentence settle into the air between them, not as gratitude, not as coincidence, but as something closer to completion. One of the responders looked up at him briefly, curiosity flickering in his eyes, but Ethan only gave a small shake of his head, because there was nothing he could explain, not in a way that would make sense beyond this place, beyond this moment. They prepared to move her carefully, lifting her with steady hands onto a stretcher, the fabric rustling softly in the cold air. And as they did, Rex stepped forward once more, his nose brushing lightly against her hand, a single, deliberate gesture, and her fingers responded, curling just slightly, as if holding on to something invisible but real, something that had returned to her just when she needed it most. The doors of the vehicle opened, warm lights spilling out into the darkness, and as they guided her inside, she did not take her eyes off the dog, not until the last possible second, as if memorizing him, or perhaps confirming that he was truly there. And when the doors closed with a quiet, final sound, the night seemed to exhale. The engine started again, and slowly, the vehicle turned and disappeared back down the narrow path, leaving behind only the fading echo of its presence and the deep, returning silence of the forest. Ethan stood there for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air, his thoughts quiet but shifting, and beside him, Rex remained still, watching the direction where the lights had vanished, not with longing, not with confusion, but with a calm that felt almost knowing. And after a long moment, he turned away on his own, stepping back toward the trees, as if the night was not yet finished with him, and Ethan followed, understanding now that whatever had begun here had not ended with the rescue. It had only moved forward, deeper into something neither of them fully understood yet. The walk back felt different, not because the path had changed, but because something within it had. The forest no longer felt like a place they had entered, but a place that had allowed them through, and Rex moved ahead once more, not hurried, not uncertain, just steady, as if following a thread only he could see. The cold air carried the faint scent of pine and distant frost, and each step Ethan took felt quieter than the last, his mind not searching for answers anymore, but holding on to the feeling that this night had not been random, that somewhere beneath the surface of what he could understand, something had aligned with quiet precision. When they reached the edge of the trees, the cabin stood where it always had, unchanged, a small shape against the vast stillness of the land, its windows dark, its walls catching only the faintest reflection of the moonlight. Ethan opened the door and stepped inside, the air colder now, the fire long reduced to faint embers that glowed softly. In the stove, he moved to tend it, adding wood, coaxing the flame back to life until warmth slowly returned to the room. Behind him, Rex entered without hesitation, but instead of settling near the fire as before, he stopped halfway across the floor, his body still, his head turning slightly toward the far wall again. The same place he had paused earlier, his ears lifted, not sharply, but with quiet attention. As if something there had not yet finished speaking, Ethan watched him for a moment, then followed his gaze. The wall looked the same as it always had, worn wood, faint lines of age, nothing that stood out to the eye. And yet the dog did not move, did not blink. He simply stood there, listening, the kind of listening that reached beyond sound. Ethan stepped closer, slow and deliberate, the floor creaking softly beneath his boots. He placed his hand against the wood, feeling its cold surface, waiting for something he could not name. At first there was nothing, just the solid stillness of a cabin that had seen too many quiet years. But then, faintly, almost too subtle to notice, there was a difference, not a sound, not exactly. More like a hollow beneath the surface, a space where there should have been none. Ethan pressed again, shifting his hand slightly, and the wood gave just a fraction, enough to confirm what he had not been looking for, but had somehow found. Behind him, Rex exhaled softly, the sound low and steady, not surprise, not excitement, but recognition, as if this discovery was not new to him, only new to Ethan. The fire crackled quietly in the background, casting shifting light across the wall, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, more focused, as if everything had narrowed to this one point, this one hidden detail waiting to be uncovered. Ethan stepped back slightly, his eyes tracing the edges of the panel. The faint seemed barely visible unless you knew where to look, and he realized then that whatever had brought them into the forest, whatever had led them to the woman, had not ended there. It had followed them back, or perhaps it had been here all along, waiting, patient as time itself. And Rex lowered himself slowly onto the floor near the wall, his body relaxed now, his head resting between his paws. But his eyes remained open, watching, as if his part in this was not to act, but to witness. And Ethan stood there in the quiet glow of the fire, understanding that some doors do not open until everything else has fallen into place, and tonight, something had begun to open. The fire had settled into a steady glow, its light stretching across the wooden walls in slow, breathing patterns, and Ethan stood there for a long moment without moving, his hand still resting near the seam in the wall, as if waiting for it to reveal something more on its own. But nothing else came, only the quiet crackle of burning wood and the faint whisper of wind outside. And yet the feeling remained that something was there, something just beneath the surface, not hidden by force, but by time. He stepped closer again, this time running his fingers along the edge more carefully, tracing the line where one panel met another. The difference was subtle, almost invisible, but once noticed, it could not be unseen. A slight gap, a change in the grain, a place where the wood did not quite belong to the rest. Behind him, Rex shifted slightly, but did not rise, his eyes following every movement with calm attention, as if this moment required patience rather than urgency. Ethan pressed against the panel once more, firmer this time, and felt it give just enough to confirm what instinct had already told him. This was not just a wall. It was a door that had forgotten it was meant to open. He glanced around the room, his eyes settling on a small iron poker resting near the stove. He picked it up, testing its weight in his hand before returning to the wall. Carefully, he worked the tip into the narrow seam, applying slow pressure, not forcing, just guiding. And for a second, nothing happened. Then came a soft sound, a faint shift, like wood remembering how to move. The panel loosened slightly, enough for him to grip the edge with his fingers, and with a steady pull, it opened inward just a few inches, releasing a breath of colder air from within, not sharp, not unpleasant, just different. as if the space behind it had been sealed away from the rest of the world for longer than anyone could remember. Ethan paused, listening, but there was no sound from inside. Only a deeper quiet, one that seemed to absorb rather than reflect. He widened the opening slowly, the hinges moving without protest, and the light from the fire slipped inside, revealing the outline of a narrow passage, no more than 3 feet wide, descending gently downward, the walls rough but intentional, the floor worn smooth as if it had once been walked many times. Long ago, he stood at the threshold, the warmth of the cabin at his back and the cool stillness of the hidden space before him. And for a moment, he did not step forward, not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of what he had uncovered. Behind him, Rex rose quietly to his feet, moving closer without hesitation, his presence steady and certain, and when he reached Ethan's side, he did not look into the passage immediately. Instead, he looked at Ethan, just for a brief second, their eyes meeting in a way that carried more understanding than words ever could. Then the dog turned and stepped forward, crossing the threshold as if it was not unfamiliar, as if this path, like the one through the forest, had already been walked before. Ethan followed, his boots touching the first step into the hidden space. And as he moved deeper, the light from the fire stretched thinner behind him, until the cabin felt distant, like something left behind rather than something waiting ahead. The air inside was still, carrying a faint scent of aged wood and something older, something that did not belong to decay but to memory. And with each step downward, the quiet grew thicker, not empty, but full, as if the walls themselves held on to something they had never been asked to release. And somewhere ahead, just beyond the reach of the fading light, Rex paused again, his ears lifting slightly, his body still, not in warning, but in recognition, as if whatever lay further within had been waiting not just to be found, but to be returned to. The passage narrowed as Ethan moved deeper, the air growing cooler with each step, carrying a stillness that felt untouched by time, and the faint light from the cabin behind him faded until it was no longer light at all, but only memory. His eyes adjusting slowly to the dimness ahead, guided more by instinct than sight, and just beyond the bend of the narrow corridor, Rex stood waiting, not tense, not uncertain, but calm in a way that suggested this place did not surprise him, as if it belonged to something he already understood. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, its beam cutting a thin line through the darkness, revealing walls reinforced with old timber and a floor worn smooth in a way that spoke of years, not accidents. And then the space opened slightly into a small chamber, no more than 10 feet across, its ceiling low but solid, and at the center of it sat a wooden chest, aged but intact, its surface marked by careful hands rather than neglect, dust resting lightly across it like a quiet layer of forgotten years. Ethan stepped closer, the sound of his boots softened by the packed earth beneath him, and Rex followed just behind, his breathing steady, his presence grounding the moment. The beam of light drifted across the room, catching small details, a metal hook along the wall, a faded blanket folded neatly in one corner, a lantern long emptied of oil, all of it arranged not as storage, but as if someone had once lived here, waited here, perhaps hidden here. And then his light returned to the chest, resting on it fully now. And for a moment, he did not touch it, because something about it felt less like an object and more like a message, something placed with intention, something meant to be found only when the time was right. Behind him, Rex took a slow step forward and sat beside the chest, his posture straight despite his age, his eyes fixed on it with quiet focus. And Ethan noticed then the faint tag that still hung from the dog's collar, the metal worn but legible under the beam of light. He reached down gently, turning it just enough to read, and beneath the official markings, there was an engraving he had not seen before, smaller, older, etched by hand rather than machine, a name, followed by a date, and then a single word, return. Ethan felt a subtle shift inside him, not shock, not fear, but a recognition that settled deeper than thought. He looked back at the chest, then at Rex, and the connection between them no longer felt coincidental, it felt deliberate, as if the path from the shelter to the forest, from the forest to the woman, and now to this hidden place had been drawn long before either of them had stepped onto it. He knelt slowly, placing the flashlight beside him so its beam rested across the lid, his hands hovering for a second before finally settling against the wood. The surface was cold but steady, real, and with a careful breath, he lifted the lid, the hinges moving with a soft, unresisting sound, and inside, the light revealed a collection of items placed with care, not wealth, not gold, but something far more personal. A folded flag, worn but preserved, a set of old photographs bound together with twine, and beneath them, a small envelope, sealed but marked with a name written in careful script. Ethan did not open it yet. He simply looked at it, then slowly turned his head toward Rex, and the old dog met his gaze without movement, without question, as if he had already done what he came to do, and now the rest belonged to Ethan alone. And in that quiet underground space, with the weight of something unseen finally taking shape, Ethan understood that this was not the end of a journey. It was the answer to one that had begun long before he ever knew it existed. The envelope felt lighter than Ethan expected, almost as if whatever weight it carried was not physical, but something else entirely, something tied to time and memory rather than paper and ink. He turned it slowly in his hands, the name written across the front catching the beam of the flashlight, and for a moment, he simply stared at it, because the name was not his, not anyone he recognized. Yet it felt familiar in a way he could not explain, like hearing a voice you had forgotten, but somehow still understood. Rex remained beside him, quiet and steady, his presence grounding the moment as it had all along. And after a long breath, Ethan slid his finger beneath the edge of the seal and opened it carefully, the paper inside unfolding with a soft sound that echoed faintly in the small chamber. He lifted it closer to the light, his eyes moving across the words written in a careful, steady hand. If you are reading this, then he found you, just like he found me. Ethan paused, the sentence settling into the silence around him, his gaze flicking briefly toward Rex before returning to the letter. This dog does not forget, not the paths, not the people, not the promises made in quiet places when no one else is listening. Years ago, when I had nothing left, he came to me in the same way, out of nowhere and exactly when I needed him. He led me here, showed me this place, and in doing so, he gave me more than shelter. He gave me time, and in that time, I found something worth leaving behind. Ethan's grip on the paper tightened slightly, not from tension, but from the weight of understanding beginning to form. The woman you helped tonight, her name is Margaret Hale. She was part of the program that trained dogs like him. She believed they carried more than commands, that they carried memory in ways we never fully understood. She saved him once, long before I ever met him, and I believe that is why he returns, not by accident, but by something deeper than instinct. Ethan lowered the letter slightly, the name echoing in his mind. Margaret, the way she had looked at Rex, the way she had spoken, it had not been confusion, it had been recognition. He lifted the letter again, continuing. Everything in this chest belongs to no one and to everyone. It is not about ownership. It is about continuation. If he has brought you here, then it means you are part of that now. Take what you need, leave what you can, and trust him, because he will always know where to go next. The final line was shorter, almost an afterthought, but it lingered the longest. Some things are not lost. They are only waiting to be found again. Ethan let the paper fall slightly in his hands, the silence returning around him, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full, as if the space itself had been holding on to these words, waiting for them to be heard again. He looked at Rex, really looked, and for the first time, he did not see an old dog nearing the end of his years. He saw something else, something that moved through time differently, something that carried purpose beyond a single life. Rex met his gaze without hesitation, his amber eyes calm, steady, certain, and in that moment, Ethan understood that this was not where the story ended, not for him, not for the dog, and not for whatever path had brought them together. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope, setting it gently within the chest before rising to his feet. The small chamber no longer felt hidden, it felt revealed, and as he turned toward the narrow passage leading back up, Rex stood as well, moving ahead once more, not looking back, not needing to, because some paths do not require questions, only the willingness to follow. And as Ethan stepped after him, leaving the quiet space behind, He carried with him not just the memory of what he had found, but the quiet certainty that somewhere ahead, another door was already waiting.